The archetype of the tortured artist, poet, or writer has been proliferated in our society for centuries. Most recently, we've been made aware of it by Taylor Swift's latest album, The Tortured Poets Department. And both Zach and I have been watching essays and reading papers on why we have this archetype, so let's get into it. This is Quid Pros Quo. I'm Rin.
And I'm Zac.
And today we are talking about the psychology of creative writing and why you may or may not be a tortured writer.
Love it. This episode is covering two different papers. One of them is The Psychology of Creative Writing by Forgeard, Kaufman and Kaufman. And our second paper that we are reviewing is Positive Psychology and Creative Writing in Education by Tsatsou-Nikolouli.
So these papers together will hopefully be giving us an understanding of how psychopathology and positive psychology both affect creative writers and their crafts. First, let's go into some definitions. Psychopathology is the fancy clinical term for mental illness. Mm-hmm. In this episode, we'll be talking a lot about like bipolar, depression, anxiety, general things that like are pathologies of the psychos. Is that the right word? The psyche, yes. I was like, psychos is not right. We're doing great. Also, this is our first episode of our new style of episodes, and we are both so excited about it. So welcome back to the show. Welcome to the show if you're new. And positive psychology is a field of psychology on basically how positive thinking affects our psyche and how it can be beneficial for not only our psyche, but our physiological bodies and our lives overall.
So we're tackling creative writing on both ends of the spectrum of mental wellness, where it's how does creative writing relate to when the mind is functioning really, really well, and also when the mind is functioning differently, or when its functioning is hampered by some kind of condition or illness.
So let's dig right into it with Forgeard, Kaufman and Kaufman. We'll put links to these papers, where we found them, just on Google in the show notes, so you can follow along if you'd like, or pause the episode, read the paper, because it's hard to follow along with an academic paper sometimes, especially if you don't have an academic background. Like, give yourself patience, give yourself time. It will take a little bit to get used to reading academic papers, and just give yourself grace. So, with Forgeard, Kaufman and Kaufman, they open with saying creative writing has been not very much studied in psychology, and because in order to appreciate and understand creative writing and psychology, we need an interdisciplinary approach. And those can be kind of hard to find in any field. Like, it's hard to find an interdisciplinary approach because you have to find people who want to work who are also interested in the interdisciplinary approach. It can be really complex and complicated, so that's why there's not been a lot of research on this.
There's also considerations with funding, where with interdisciplinary stuff, it gets kind of tricky to do funding and to find who's going to pay for it.
Especially because a lot of research comes out of universities, and universities don't, to my understanding, do not generally like putting funding towards two departments at once. It has to come out of one department or the other, and one department doesn't want to be like, well, that's not our department. Why would we do that?
It's all about the money, folks.
Academia? What a mess. So glad I'm not in it anymore. I say this as I'm planning to go back to grad school eventually, and you're starting grad school.
I am starting grad school. A few weeks more, and I'll be a PhD candidate.
Possibly by the time this goes up.
Wow, that's kind of weird to think about.
Yeah, it is weird to think about. Anyways, so the next thing Forgeard, Kaufman and Kaufman talk about in their paper is the portrayal of creative writers, where they're kind of unconventional and eccentric, where laymen are not, and their personality traits are numerous and include things like, and this is going to be a laundry list, so stick with me, openness to experience, autonomy, introversion, questioning social norms. For example, think of how books drive social changes. Self-confidence, self-acceptance, ambition, dominance, hostility, and impulsivity. And these personality traits tend to remain stable over time because a little bit about the psychology of personality, like, it's not fixed, like, it's malleable. But with creative writers, these are the traits that tend to stay pretty stable over time.
Yeah. So when you're looking at the the psychology of creative writers, this is what the portrayal is of what creative writers look like. And what Forgeard, Kaufman, and Kaufman are doing inside of this essay is that they're comparing what's going on inside of this portrayal with what is being shown in the data. And they're looking at it through psychopathology. And what they found is that creative writers tend to have a higher proportion of affective disorders than the general populace. So affective disorders are things like bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and alcoholism. There's a big question as to why this is. If you've ever taken a statistics class, you have had it drilled into your brain that correlation does not equal causation. And so what Forgeard and Kaufman have shown is that we have a correlation. We don't necessarily know what the cause, but there are a couple of hypotheses about what this linkage may be about. The first one is that it may be self-selection. So if you are a person that is impacted by one of these disorders, you may choose to be a creative writer, and you may choose to identify as a creative writer. And if that's the case, then there's the question of, well, why is that? But then there's the other way of thinking about it, which is considering whether there is something about creative writing that is driving psychopathology.
Like Zach just said, it may cause or exacerbate pathopsychology because creative writing often tends to lend itself to rumination, and that's just the cycle of like getting caught in a negative thought loop, which is really prominent in other affective disorders like OCD or OCPD. But also, maybe creative writing sometimes lends itself to ending the cycle of rumination. And depending on the type of creative writing you're doing, this may be different. Today I was listening to an episode of The Psychology of Your 20s, which is another fantastic podcast, and they were talking about journaling. And journaling can be creative writing, and journaling is actually psychologically proven to actually have positive benefits. But like poetry, on the other hand, is more for like expression of emotions rather than processing them. Poems that you sit in your emotions instead of move through them. The type of creative writing you're doing can really affect how it affects the cycle of rumination. We've talked about this before, probably. I don't have the episode number off the top of my head, but the React structure with Freytag's pyramid, that we talked about how that mirrors the biofeedback triangle, where you have a stress, you have the stress response, and you go up to a peak, and then you fall back down. And good stories should take you through the biofeedback pyramid.
Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of closure that can, in certain contexts be helpful for moving through some kind of emotional difficulty or some kind of big psychological event that's happening in your life. That's the hypothesis as far as what may be going on in our brains when we write creatively.
Yeah. Additionally, like as bad as it may look that creative writing may be bad for us or may be good for us, the fact that there are so many creative writers who have psychopathologies, it shows that the creative writers are resilient. They have some degree of psychological health and ego strength. And what I took to mean from this is Forgeard, Kaufman, and Kaufman didn't use this term, but grit, which was a term coined by Angela Duckworth, I believe. But just like the ability to like stick something through. And it's possible that creative writing is helping writers like develop this grit so they can like keep moving through life and be more productive.
That grit is really important when you're working on, the same project for a long period of time, which is if you've ever written a novel, that it takes a lot of effort because you plan and then you have to write the stupid thing. And then after you're done with that, you have to edit and revise and send it off to people to read. And then they come back and say, these are more changes that you need to make. So you spend a lot of time on the same thing. And if you can get to the end, you have a lot of grit. I'm not going to say that you have more grit than the average person, but it is something that is impressive and is worth recognizing.
Absolutely. Like you say, writers like have to go through like that process, and it takes a lot of grit. Forgeard, Kaufman, and Kaufman proposed two processes. One was from another scientist that like looked at the writing process, and I did not write down that scientist's name in the show notes. It's in my physical notes that are over there on my desk. But I'm not gonna go grab them. There's too much work. But the first process that they lay out in the paper is reflection, production, and text interpretation, where you reflect on your feelings and emotions, and then you produce some writing about them, and then you interpret it, or edit it, go back and like refine it. The second process is kind of an expansion of that first process, where you have a preparation stage. We would often call that like brainstorming, or like just like getting ready to write, an incubation, where the idea is coming to fruition more so than just the preparation stage. Then the illumination is like an aha moment, and this is when like words tend to get onto the page, or like in the process of writing you have an aha moment. And then verification is when you have, it's that sense of finality that we talked about a few minutes ago, where you have a sense of like coming to an end of a process.
So those are some of the ways that these scientists are looking at, the writer's process, which is it's pretty different from the way that the writing process is normally taught inside of school, where you're looking at different phases based off of the activity that you're doing. Whereas this is a little bit more nebulous, and encompasses more of the different kinds of activities that you might be doing. An important component of the psychology of creative writing is that creative writing is a process that can induce flow. Flow is a sense of euphoria or of being in the zone. The term flow, I believe, was coined by Mikhail.
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
There you go. You have it.
And my biggest flex that I know how to say his name. I love him. He's so cool.
But so there are lots of creative and like physical things that you can do in order to induce flow. This is something that you see in great athletes, in great artists, in musicians. But to get into this state of flow, there needs to be intrinsic motivation to create, regular feedback, as well as the sense that you're doing well. Because if you are aware of the fact that you're not doing well, it becomes really frustrating rather than euphoric. And there needs to be an element of inward focus to help quiet that inner critic, to be able to be in the moment. In one of our last episodes before the 100th episode, we talked about the importance of building writing rituals, and that can be an important component to developing a flow state when you are writing, which feeds into... Sorry, go for it.
And I was going to say, in a couple episodes, we're going to have a talk about paper about proper criticism and like how to give and receive feedback, and like how to, I think the phrase that we have in the show notes for that episode that we'll be recording next time we meet is to not instill the terror of the reader, or something is how the paper puts it. So looking back and looking forward, we have stuff about getting feedback and maximizing that inward focus.
Getting into that flow state is really important to the positive aspects of creative writing, which are summarized inside of the article by Tsatsou-Nikolouli, where creative writing can lead to things like joy, optimism, pleasure, meaning, and strong interpersonal relationships, which are important to life satisfaction. Part of this is through developing flow, but there's also the positive psychology impact of accomplishments, where things that you've done in the past can help you to be happy now. If you're satisfied with the things that you have done in the past, if you have had experiences with flow states inside of the past, that can contribute to positive mental well-being in the present. So that's the past elements of developing a positive mind space and a positive psyche. There are also the elements of cultivating optimism and hope. Those are things that go into positive psychology overall, but it's also important inside of writing. If you are in a spot where you are optimistic about your writing, about being able to find people who are going to be interested and who are going to like your writing, that is going to reflect, that is going to contribute to a better sense of well-being than if you're constantly telling yourself that nobody is going to like what you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to cultivating that positive mindset, like around your current and past writing, you can also think of like optimism and hope as the parts of the future for your positive psychology mindset. And you have to like, you know, have optimism that things are going to work out with your writing, that you're going to be able to publish in the way you want. Like, these things will also really contribute to having a positive impact on your writing, and in turn your writing having a positive impact on you. So that was like 20 minutes of academic content.
So
let's talk about take a breather, just like pause the podcast, try and like internalize that, go back if you need to.
Grab some water. Stay hydrated. And now let's talk about what this means for you as a writer and an author. So understanding the basics of the psychology of creative writing can give us insights into how our minds work when we're working creatively. Creatively? Yes, creatively. Because creativity is a practice. And as a Buddhist, I'm constantly thinking about the word practice because you say, like, I practice Buddhism and we practice kindness. And it's like, the implication there is you are never going to be perfect at it because you're practicing it. Like, you're practicing it to become better at doing it, but there is no end to the practice. It's a gameplay loop, like we talked about with Christian in episode 96, which goes up tomorrow of the day we are recording this. Another important thing to remember is that when talking about the illumination stage, right? If you are just waiting for that to happen, it's not going to come, or at least it's not going to come with any regularity to be able to enjoy the positive benefits of writing regularly. Rin has a favorite quote from W. Somerset Maugham, where he says, "I write only when inspiration strikes. Fortunately, it strikes every morning at 9 o'clock sharp," which is when he sits down in the chair to write. So developing those habits and those rituals, going back to the importance of making meaning and settling into a flow state inside of writing, are important to being able to have that illumination that goes into creativity.
As we've already talked about flow a ton in this episode, another concept that goes really well with flow is the concept of play, which is a flow state, but usually around something more fun than just like work. Because like work can put you in a flow state, but work is not always play. Mm-hmm. And play and flow together are so important to combat the psychopathology many of us struggle with as creative writers. Because if you're a creative writer and if the studies are to be believed, you probably have like something going on in your head that is not neurotypical. It is often depression or anxiety, as we said earlier. But creative writing can be a form of play, and even though it's not always play, like sometimes it definitely feels more like work. I'm revising draft 3 of Dawnless for beta readers, and that feels a lot like work and not like play. But like writing, like the first draft was so much play, and it was so important for me to be able to sit down and like play with these emotions and process these emotions that Dawnless explores.
Yeah, play is something really interesting to think about because play is something that distinguishes humans from a lot of other animals because we continue to play when we get older. Like, we play sports, we play games, we play inside of our, with our hobbies. That's not, those aren't things that most other living things do. And so part of it being human is remembering to play. I saw a post on social media a couple days ago where somebody was talking about how if you're in a funk, and you're having a hard time reaching that illumination phase, playing and writing something intentionally bad and just having fun with it is a mechanism for being able to enter the illumination phase of your writing process.
I did that a couple months ago and it worked, and I put it up on my Substack, which, by the way, Zac has migrated to Substack now. Substack, sponsor us.
Rin convinced me to ditch MailChimp.
I know. I'm so proud of it. We texted for like 2 hours one morning talking all about it. It was great. Perfect. Yeah. Because, like, as we're talking about, as you mentioned this fun fact about other animals not really playing when they reach maturity, I think of, like, animals in zoos that need enrichment.
Yeah.
And just, like, think of it as enrichment for yourself. Like, I find self-care goes a lot easier when I'm like, oh, the tiger in this enclosure needs some enrichment, and I'm the tiger. But if I'm giving, it just it works great. It's a great self-care hack when I don't feel like actually self-caring. Second to last, you can analyze your process. Which of the two mentioned in the paper does it align with? Does your process align with, and does it line up with one of them, or do you need to better develop and analyze your own process? So you may not have the fancy science terms for it, such as preparation, incubation, illumination, verification, which feels like it should be a song the way I just said it. It was very sing-songy. It may not have, like, the fancy words for it. You can just call it brainstorm, write, revise, or what, any mashup of words that you want to do, you can do that. But you should email us about it and tell us all about your writing process, and we would love to feature you.
Last but not least, one of the major things to take away from the combination of these papers is to basically apply the Marie Kondo principle, which is to consider if your process and your projects are inspiring joy. When you're looking for the things inside of your writing that inspire joy, those contribute to positive psychology, and those that contribute to a sense of well-being. So anything that you can do to increase the amount of joy that you are experiencing inside of your writing is something that is definitely worth pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. To do a quick recap of this episode, we talked about the psychology of creative writing, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, as the saying goes. We talked a lot about grit, we talked about flow and play, we talked about positive psychology and how it can improve life satisfaction. We talked about how creative writing feeds into these elements, and these elements feed back into creative writing. And we talked about how understanding these things gives us insights into our own minds, how they work when we're creating our stories and writing our books. Zac, anything to add?
I don't.
Excellent. This has been Quid Pros Quo. We'll see you next week. But notably, I know we talked about this, we'll talk about this in episode 100 when we record it, because we are recording out of order right now. But starting with season 5 in 2025, we will have episodes every other week, but they will be longer episodes. You'll notice this one is somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. That's the new length you can expect from us. So we love to have you here. We'll see you next week on Quid Pros Quo.